Welcome to the Deep Dive. We're here to explore those big, sometimes tricky ideas that really shape how we see ourselves and the world, drawing on some fascinating source material. You know that feeling, right? When you make a really big decision. That strong conviction, like, yes, I chose this, or this was my decision. It feels like you're totally in charge, the captain steering your own ship. We pretty much live our lives based on that feeling of having free will. But what if that feeling, that sense of complete control, of pure choice, isn't quite the whole story? What if it's more like, well, an illusion? What if things like our memories, our biology, maybe even past trauma, or just the culture we're soaked in are pulling strings behind the scenes? Fear, desire, all guiding us before we consciously choose. Okay, let's unpack this. Today, we're doing a deep dive into this very idea. We'll look at arguments from neuroscience, philosophy, psychology, even marketing, all suggesting that maybe, just maybe, our choices are often set in motion long before we show up consciously. We're using insights from our main source, the illusion of choice, to try and understand these hidden forces.
Yeah, it's definitely a topic that can feel a bit unsettling at first. The idea that maybe our choices aren't entirely our own can be, well, disorienting. But what's fascinating here is that the point isn't to say you have no agency or that you should just stop making decisions. Not at all. It's more about enriching your perspective,
Mm.
giving you a clearer, maybe more honest way to look at your own decisions and the world around you. It's really about getting honest about what choice actually means, rather than just sticking to this idea of absolute limitless freedom. And understanding this, surprisingly, might actually be empowering.
Right, so if we're trying to understand choice, the brain seems like the obvious place to start. I mean, it's the control center, right? But what science is finding about the moment we decide something, it's kind of staggering. It really makes you question when a decision actually begins. Because the evidence suggests our brains might be making moves before we, our conscious selves, are even in the loop. Here's where it gets really interesting.
It really does. And this whole line of questioning, scientifically speaking, got a huge pushback in the 1980s. There was this neuroscientist, Benjamin Libet. He conducted this famous experiment, really groundbreaking stuff, that cast serious doubt on our usual idea of conscious free will. So what he did was ask people to do something super simple. Just flick their wrist whenever they felt the urge. Completely spontaneous, no signal or anything.
Yeah.
While they did this, they had to watch this special fast clock and pinpoint the exact moment they felt the decision, the conscious intention, to move. At the same time, Libet and his team were using EEG to measure brain activity. Specifically, they were looking for something called the readiness potential.
The readiness potential, that's like the brain gearing up for action.
Exactly. It's this buildup of electrical activity that reliably happens right before you make a voluntary movement. And here's the bombshell finding. That readiness potential, the brain signal preparing the movement, consistently started firing hundreds of milliseconds before the person reported consciously deciding to flick their wrist.
Hundreds of milliseconds before they even felt they decided.
That's right. Think about that gap. The brain was already initiating the action, preparing the neural pathways. And only then, afterwards, did the conscious mind kind of catch up and register, okay, I've decided now.
Mm.
Our source uses a great analogy for this. It's like a politician giving a speech at the ribbon cutting of a project they never built.
Huh. That's perfect. The brain does the work and consciousness shows up late for the photo op. Wow. So that must have sent ripples through science and philosophy back then. And I imagine the research hasn't just stopped there.
Oh, absolutely not. Lippitt's work really opened the floodgates. Modern studies, using much more advanced tech like fMRI scans, have basically sharpened that blade, as you said. They've pushed the timeline even further back.
Further back, how much further?
In some studies, researchers can now predict a person's choice, like whether they'll press a button with their left or right hand, sometimes seconds before the person themselves is aware of having made that choice.
Seconds. Not milliseconds, but actual seconds.
Yes, several seconds in some experiments. They can see patterns of brain activity that correlate with the upcoming decision way before the conscious experience of choosing happens. So this really strengthens the implication. That story we tell ourselves, I chose this because of X, Y, and Z. It's often what neuroscientists call post hoc narration.
Post hoc narration, like writing the explanation after the event.
Exactly. It's more like an editing process, creating a coherent narrative for an action that was already underway, rather than being the original author of that decision.
So just think about that for a moment. What does it mean if you're the conscious? You aren't really the author, but more like the editor explaining impulses that came from somewhere deeper in the brain. Kind of flips our whole idea of self-control on its head, doesn't it? We're crafting the backstory for a movie that's already started rolling.
And it's important to stress this isn't some, fringe idea from one rogue lab. It's supported by some really influential models in psychology, too. Think about Daniel Kahneman's work on System 1 and System 2 thinking. He won a Nobel for this stuff. System 1 is that fast, automatic, intuitive part of our mind. It runs the show most of the time, making snap judgments, reacting instantly. It acts without us really thinking, like when you instantly know 2 plus 2, 4.
Right. The autopilot system?
Pretty much. And System 2 is the slower, deliberate, conscious part. It requires effort, attention. It's what we use for complex problems, focusing, and importantly, for justifying and interpreting what System 1 just did. So our conscious mind, Kahneman's System 2, often steps in to create a rational explanation for an action or feeling that originated in the fast, unconscious System 1.
Okay, so System 1 pulls the trigger, System 2 explains why.
In many cases, yes. And then there's Jonathan Haidt's metaphor, which I think is really powerful, the rider on an elephant. He pictures the conscious mind as the rider sitting atop this huge, powerful elephant, which represents our unconscious, our emotions, our gut feelings, our ingrained habits. The rider thinks they're in charge, holding the reins, steering. But Haidt argues that most of the time, it's the elephant the unconscious drives that's actually determining the direction. Where the elephant wants to go, it goes.
And the writer's job.
The writer's job is often just to come up with convincing reasons for why they intended to go in the direction the elephant was already headed. It's a post hoc rationalization machine.
So the elephant leans towards, say, avoiding a confrontation, and the writer quickly constructs a logical reason like, oh, it's not the right time, or it wouldn't be productive.
Exactly. And these concepts, System 1, System 2, rider, elephant, they're pretty central in cognitive science now. They all point to this same core idea. That feeling of making a choice often pops into our awareness after the real decision-making process, deep in the unconscious, is already well underway.
It makes you wonder, doesn't it? How often is your writer just scrambling to make sense of where your elephant is taking you? It's fascinating, almost spooky, how the brain seems to be playing chess moves ahead of our conscious awareness. But what's maybe even more striking is that this whole debate isn't new. Long before brain scans, philosophers were wrestling with these exact same deep questions about free will. And honestly, some of their conclusions, reached just through thinking, sound remarkably similar to what neuroscience is suggesting today. What can centuries of philosophy tell us about this feeling of freedom we cherish?
It's quite amazing, the continuity. You go back to the 17th century to Baruch Spinoza, a Dutch philosopher with a really rigorous, deterministic view. Spinoza basically argued that our feeling of freedom is just, well, a mistake, a misunderstanding of how things really work. He said we feel free simply because we're ignorant of all the complex causes that are actually determining our actions.
Ignorant of the causes. So if we knew everything that led up to a choice.
Yeah, we'd see it wasn't a choice at all, but an inevitability, like a chain reaction.
Yeah.
If you could trace every single factor, physical laws, past events, brain states, you'd see the outcome was necessary. Yeah, this great analogy, imagine a stone thrown into the air. If that stone could think, Spinoza said, it would believe it was choosing its own path, flying freely.
Right. It wouldn't be aware of the thrower, the force, gravity, air resistance.
Exactly. It would just feel the motion and assume it was its own volition. Spinoza thought we're basically like that thinking stone. Our feeling of freedom comes from not seeing the whole causal chain. For him, everything, including our thoughts and actions, is part of this vast interconnected web of cause and effect governed by natural laws. Freedom is the illusion born from our limited perspective within that web.
That's a pretty stark picture. Puts us right into a cosmic machine almost. Then fast forward a couple of centuries and you get Friedrich Nietzsche. He comes at it from a totally different, much more fiery angle. Nietzsche didn't just doubt free will, he actively ridiculed it. He called it a priestly invention.
Right, he saw it as a tool, a concept created for a specific purpose, not a truth about humanity.
And that purpose was?
Control, essentially. Nietzsche argued that the idea of free will was invented mainly to justify assigning guilt and blame, to make people feel responsible for their actions, especially their sins. This allowed religious and moral authorities to punish, to judge, and to maintain social order through fear and the promise of salvation, all based on the idea that you could have chosen differently.
He didn't see will as this neat, rational thing inside us making clear choices. He saw it more like a chaotic internal battleground.
Exactly, a battlefield of drives, instincts, unconscious forces wearing masks. He believed we're driven by these deeper, often conflicting primal urges, like his famous will to power. Our conscious choices, in his view, are often just surface phenomena, rationalizations, masking these more fundamental drives. Your choice to be kind might mask a desire for social standing, for example.
It really undermines our noble narratives about ourselves, doesn't it?
It certainly challenges them. And then you have Arthur Schopenhauer, another German philosopher, who had this incredibly concise and powerful way of putting it. He said, "A man can do what he wills, but he cannot will what he wills."
Okay, unpack that one.
Yeah.
Can do what he wills, but cannot will what he wills.
It means you can act on your desires. If you will or desire to eat the cake, you can choose to eat it, assuming it's there. You have the freedom to act according to your will. But Schopenhauer says you didn't choose the will itself. You didn't choose to desire the cake in the first place, rather than, say, desiring the apple or desiring nothing at all.
So I can pick between cake and apple, but I didn't pick my underlying preference for sweet things or healthy things.
Precisely. Those fundamental appetites, preferences, desires, they arise from your nature, your biology, your past experiences. They are given, not chosen. You can follow your desires, but you can't choose what desires you fundamentally have. Your will is shaped by factors beyond your conscious control. So your conscious choices are really just expressions of this deeper unchosen will.
That distinction feels important. The freedom to act versus the freedom to determine the desire itself. But then what about the existentialists? People like Sartre and Camus, they're always talked about as champions of freedom and choice.
They are, but it's a very different kind of freedom they talk about. They weren't naive. They didn't believe in some kind of magical, uncaused free will either. For them, freedom wasn't about being uninfluenced. It was actually, well, Sartre called it terror.
Terror. Why terror?
The terror of radical responsibility and what they saw as an absurd world, a world with no preordained meaning, no divine plan, no objective values to guide you. You are condemned to be free, as Sartre famously put it, condemned to make choices, to define yourself through your actions, knowing full well you're shaped by forces you don't fully control, your facticity, your body, your situation, and knowing there are no guarantees, no cosmic safety net. So freedom for them wasn't a happy, easy thing. It was this heavy, often agonizing burden of having to choose and take responsibility in a meaningless universe while fully acknowledging all the constraints. He was tragic.
So their freedom is less about limitless options and more about the weight of choosing within limits in a world without a script.
Exactly. It shifts the focus from, am I totally unconstrained, to how do I act authentically and take responsibility given that I am constrained and the universe offers no guidance. This raises an important question, doesn't it? How do all these different philosophical perspectives, Spinoza's necessity, Nietzsche's critique, Schopenhauer's unchosen will, the existentialist's tragic freedom, challenge our everyday common sense notion of just making a choice? They all seem to suggest our intuitive grasp of agency is, well, maybe a bit too simple.
Okay, so our brains might be ahead of us. Philosophers have been doubting for ages.
Yeah.
But there's another huge influence, right? Something more out there. Society. Specifically, how does the world we live in, especially our consumer-driven culture, play into this? Does it actually reinforce the illusion of choice, maybe even profit from it?
Oh, absolutely. The market, in particular, has become incredibly adept at feeding the illusion, precisely because it's profitable. Choice itself has been turned into a massive consumer product. Just look around. Supermarkets with aisles and aisles of slightly different versions of the same thing, 50 kinds of breakfast cereal, endless soda options. Or think about online streaming, infinite choices, supposedly tailored just for you. Dating apps, swipe left, swipe right, endless potential partners presented as choices. It all feels like incredible freedom, like boundless possibility, like perfect self-expression through consumption.
It does feel like that. More options must mean more freedom, right?
That's the feeling it creates. But our source material raises a really sharp critique. Often this explosion of options is just a multiplication of sameness. The sheer volume of choices can mask a real lack of genuine difference or substance. Are those 50 cereals fundamentally different, or just variations in sugar content and packaging? Are the infinite shows really offering diverse worldviews, or just variations on familiar formulas designed by algorithms to keep you watching?
Like slightly different shades of the same color presented as a rainbow.
Exactly. It creates the appearance of vast freedom, while often channeling us down fairly narrow paths. The feeling of choice distracts from the potential lack of meaningful diversity within those choices.
That reminds me of the sociologist Zygmunt Bauman and his idea of liquid modernity.
Yes, Bauman's work is incredibly relevant here. He talked about how modern life is characterized by this fluidity, this constant change. Jobs, relationships, identities all seem temporary, disposable, and part of this liquid state is being bombarded with endless choices, none of which seem to offer real depth or lasting commitment. We're encouraged to keep our options open, to constantly switch, upgrade, choose again.
And he had that phrase, something like, we're drowning in choices.
Precisely. He said we drown in choices and call it liberty. His point was that this constant churn, this overwhelming quantity of superficial options, can paradoxically make us feel less grounded, less genuinely agentic. It creates anxiety, a fear of missing out, FOMO, and prevents deep engagement. So the sheer abundance of choice might actually diminish meaningful freedom rather than enhance it, leaving us feeling adrift in a sea of shallow options.
Wow. Drowning in choices and calling it liberty. That's quite an image.
And advertising is, you could say, the engine driving this whole process. It's constantly reinforcing the feeling of free choice while actively working to guide those choices. Think about how ads sell individuality by promoting mass-produced products. Express your unique self by buying the same phone card genes as millions of others.
Right. Be different, just like everyone who buys this.
Exactly. Or they frame choices for us. Choose freely. But here are the 2 or 3 options we've pre-selected and packaged attractively for you. They associate products with deep desires, freedom, connection, status, often desires that advertising itself helped to cultivate. The fundamental truth is, the market doesn't really want you to be truly radically free and unpredictable. It wants you to be predictable.
Because predictable consumers are easier to sell to.
Of course. They want to model your behavior, anticipate your desires, nudge your preferences, and they're getting incredibly good at it. Just look at online algorithms. They track your clicks, your viewing habits, your purchases. They often know what you're likely to want or do next before you consciously know it. Think about those uncanny product recommendations or the news feed that seems to read your mind. How much that is just reflecting your free choices and how much is subtly shaping them, guiding you down paths designed by unseen code. It's a constant, low-level manipulation masquerading as personalized service.
Okay, so we've got the brain's early moves, philosophical doubts, societal and market pressures. What about the stuff inside us, our own personal history, our psychology? How do our own deep-seated patterns, maybe things we're not even aware of, steer our choices from within? Let's turn inwards now.
Yeah, this brings us into the realm of psychology, and you really have to start with Freud, even though psychology has moved on in many ways. His core insight remains powerful. Freud was pretty blunt about it. He famously said, "The ego is not master in its own house."
Meaning our conscious self isn't really in charge?
Not entirely, no. He argued that our conscious ego is constantly dealing with powerful forces from the unconscious, things like repressed memories, hidden desires, unresolved conflicts, often stemming from childhood. These unconscious dynamics, he believed, are the real forces steering the ship, while the conscious ego, the captain in his analogy, is often unaware, maybe drinking below deck, just reacting to the shifts and turns dictated from below.
So decisions we think are rational might actually be driven by old wounds or hidden wishes.
That was Freud's fundamental argument. Psychoanalysis is built on uncovering these hidden influences, and while the specific theories have been debated and revised endlessly, that core idea that our conscious awareness is just the tip of the iceberg remains incredibly influential.
Right. And how does modern psychology see this? Does it still hold on to that idea of powerful unconscious drivers?
Largely, yes, although the language and models have changed. Contemporary psychology, drawing on cognitive science and neuroscience, confirms the massive role of unconscious processes, but frames it differently. Take habits, for instance. We now understand much more about the neuroscience of habit formation. Actions repeated over time literally rewire the brain, creating efficient neural pathways. These habits become so automatic that, as our source says, they carve grooves in the brain so deep that choice is mostly momentum.
Like driving a familiar route, you barely even think about the turns.
Exactly. And think how much of your day runs on that kind of autopilot. Your morning routine, how you respond to emails, maybe even how you react in arguments. We're running scripts far more often than we're consciously deciding.
And trauma, you mentioned earlier.
Yes, trauma is another powerful example. We know traumatic experiences can deeply affect the brain's threat detection systems, creating triggers and responses that operate entirely outside conscious control. Someone might avoid certain situations or react intensely to specific stimuli, not as a conscious choice, but as a deeply ingrained automatic survival response linked to past trauma. Their choice architecture has been fundamentally altered.
And culture fits in here too, right? Not just the market, but deeper cultural norms.
Absolutely. Culture installs our default settings. The values, beliefs, assumptions, and social norms of our environment are absorbed, often unconsciously, from a very young age. We internalize these so deeply that they feel like our own genuine preferences or beliefs. What we desire in a partner, what we consider success, what foods we like, so much of this is culturally conditioned, not freely chosen from a blank slate.
So we're shaped by habits, trauma, culture.
Mm.
What about just inertia or fear?
Definitely.
Mm.
Even deciding not to do something or just sticking with the status quo that often isn't a neutral, rational choice either. It can be driven by fear of change, fear of failure, fear of social disapproval, or just plain inertia, the path of least resistance,
Hmm.
or conformity, the powerful subconscious urge to fit in. So often we think we're making an active choice, but as the source material puts it so well, more often we're repeating. We're running old programs, following ingrained patterns.
Mm. Repeating, not choosing. That's a sobering thought.
It is, and if we connect this to the bigger picture, what all this evidence from psychology, habits, trauma, culture, fear, inertia tells us is that our daily decisions are incredibly complex. They're shaped by this intricate interplay of factors, many operating well below the radar of our conscious awareness.
Mm.
It really reinforces that feeling that the self making the choice is navigating a landscape largely prefigured by forces it didn't consciously select.
Okay, so we've got this mounting evidence piling up from all these different fields, neuroscience, philosophy, culture, psychology, all pointing towards the idea that our sense of absolute free choice might be, well, largely an illusion. So the big question then becomes, why do we cling to it so tightly? If it's an illusion, why is it such a persistent, maybe even essential one?
That's the million-dollar question, isn't it? And the answer seems to be starkly pragmatic, because the alternative is potentially chaos. Society, as we've constructed it, kind of needs this belief to function. Think about it. If we genuinely accepted that there's no real choice, that everything is predetermined by factors beyond our control, what happens to morality? If someone's actions are just the inevitable result of their biology and environment, can we hold them morally responsible? Can we blame them? Can we punish them?
The whole basis for our justice system seems to crumble.
Exactly. And not just justice. What about praise? Why celebrate someone's achievement if it wasn't really their doing, but just the unfolding of predetermined factors? What about responsibility in everyday life? Contracts, promises. The concept of choice, the belief that individuals can choose differently and are therefore accountable for their actions, is the bedrock upon which we've built our ethical codes, our legal systems, our social structures, even our personal stories of success and failure.
It's like the foundational assumption that makes everything else make sense.
It really is. It provides the framework. Without it, assigning blame or praise becomes incoherent. Concepts like merit, desert, guilt, atonement, they all lost their grounding. It seems we need this shared, well, you could call it a useful fiction, to maintain social order and meaning.
It's such a paradox. Even the scientists studying this stuff seem to live by the illusion in their daily lives. I love that example from the source. The neuroscientist gives a brilliant talk proving determinism, explaining how free will is an illusion, and then goes home and says, I chose to have pizza for dinner, or I decided to spend time with my family.
Right. It highlights how deeply ingrained this feeling of agency is, how necessary it is for just operating in the world. Intellectually, you might accept the arguments for determinism, but experientially, we live and breathe choice. Try it yourself. Really try to internalize for just a day that nothing you do is your choice, that every thought, every action is predetermined. How does that feel?
Honestly, pretty awful. Paralyzing, maybe. Demotivating, certainly. Like, why bother trying if it's all set anyway?
Exactly. The psychological weight of pure determinism is immense. It strips away our sense of purpose, control, and meaning, so we instinctively resist it. The illusion, therefore, isn't just socially necessary, it's psychologically necessary too. It keeps society functioning, yes, but it also keeps our individual egos intact. It gives us the sense of efficacy we need to get out of bed, to strive, to relate to others. It makes guilt and forgiveness possible. So we defend the idea of free will, perhaps not because it's the absolute unvarnished truth, but because living without it feels like it might cause us, individually and collectively, to simply unravel. Our minds might be wired to maintain this belief for survival and sanity.
Okay, I have to admit, hearing all this can feel a bit bleak, like we're just puppets on strings, whether they're pulled by our neurons, our past, or the market. But is that the only conclusion? Is it all just doom and gloom, fatalism? Or could acknowledging this illusion actually open up a different kind of freedom, maybe a more realistic one?
That's exactly where this leads, I think. It's not necessarily about despair. If you really sit with it, if you honestly reflect, you start to sense that ground tilting, like we talked about. You realize, okay, my deepest beliefs, my strongest loves, even my gut reactions, they aren't purely mine. in some isolated, original sense. They're composites. They carry, as the source puts it, the fingerprints of parents, teachers, traumas, memes, chemicals, market forces. We're woven from threads we didn't choose.
A mosaic of influences, yeah.
Right. But here's the potential liberation. If absolute uncaused freedom is off the table, then maybe true selfhood isn't about possessing these things as purely original creations. Maybe it's about awareness. Maybe agency isn't found in the fantasy of being totally uninfluenced, but in the practice of becoming aware of the influences.
So freedom isn't breaking the strings, maybe it's seeing them.
That's a great way to put it. Recognizing the forces that shape you, even if you can't eliminate them entirely. That awareness itself creates a space.
And that leads to the idea of noticing the walls around our freedom. This feels really practical, actionable, like if you know you have a certain bias, maybe a political bias, or a bias towards familiar ideas, just knowing that, the source says that's already a crack in the bias.
Exactly. Awareness itself is the first step towards mitigating the influence. You can't eliminate a bias you don't know you have, but once you see it, you can question it. You can seek out other perspectives. You can pause before acting on it.
And the same for knowing you're influenced by, say, advertising or social pressure. Knowing it exists makes you less susceptible, right? It's to resist influence.
It gives you a critical distance. You can ask, is this desire genuinely mine, or was it planted? Am I conforming out of fear? That questioning is an act of agency. And even just acknowledging that your will, your desires, were shaped by all these forces, that very act of recognition is, in itself, a small act of will. It's the will to see clearly, to be honest about your own condition.
So the awareness itself becomes a form of freedom, a way to navigate within the constraints rather than just being pushed around by them.
Precisely. It's a shift from being unconsciously driven to being a conscious navigator, even if you didn't build the ship or choose the sea conditions. But there's a balance needed, right? We mentioned Nietzsche's warning about fighting monsters.
And becoming a monster yourself.
Right. And the source cleverly adapts this. If you stare too long only at the illusion, only at the deterministic forces, you risk paralysis. You get so caught up in seeing the strings that you forget to dance.
You become fatalistic, give up trying.
Exactly. But then there's the counter warning. But ignore it, and you are made a puppet thinking he is a god. If you refuse to see the strings at all, you live in a naive delusion, easily manipulated, mistaking your conditioned responses for sovereign choices. So the path seems to be this middle way, a clear-eyed awareness of the constraints, but without letting that awareness extinguish your will to act, to strive, to engage meaningfully within those constraints.
So where does this deep dive leave us? We've looked at the brain, philosophy, culture, psychology. It seems choice is far more complex and constrained than we usually think. What's the final takeaway then? Should we just stop choosing?
No, absolutely not. That's not the message at all. Life demands choices, actions, decisions. The point isn't to stop choosing. The point is to stop being naive about what choice actually entails, to approach it with more honesty, more humility, more awareness.
So it's not about rejecting choice, but understanding it differently.
Exactly. Choice isn't this mythical absolute freedom, this pure creation out of nothing. A much better way to think about it, using a beautiful analogy from our source, is as constrained improvisation.
Constrained improvisation, like jazz.
Precisely like jazz. A jazz musician improvises, right? They create something new, spontaneous, expressive in the moment. They make choices, notes, rhythms, melodies, but they're always improvising on an instrument you did not build in a key chosen long before you're born.
Ah, okay. The instrument is like our biology, our inherent talents, our psychological makeup. We didn't build it. It has its limits and possibilities.
Right. And the key chosen long before you were born, that's the cultural context, the historical moment, the social structures, the language we inherit. That's the framework, the harmonic structure we find ourselves in.
But within that structure, within those constraints of the instrument and the key, the musician can still create something unique, meaningful, expressive.
Absolutely. There's enormous room for creativity, for personal expression, for making meaningful choices within that given framework. The improvisation is real, the choices matter, the music is yours. It's just acknowledging that you're not playing in a vacuum. You're playing within a context with tools you were given. Your actions are your unique riff, but they happen within a larger score.
I like that. Constrained improvisation. It feels realistic, but still empowering. So the final message is go live, act, decide, love, resist, engage with the world fully.
Yes, do all of that. Make your choices, play your music, but do it knowing, as the source says, the stage you stand on was built by invisible hands. Do it with that awareness of the context, the history, the hidden forces, And understanding that, that's not hopelessness, that's honesty.
Honesty. Maybe that's the real goal here. Not chasing an impossible freedom, but achieving a clearer, more honest understanding of ourselves and the choices we make. Hashtag tag outro. Well, that was quite the deep dive, wasn't it? From the brain's sneaky predecisions and philosophical doubts, through the ways culture and our own psychology pull the strings, right up to why we might actually need this illusion of absolute choice. It's a lot to take in, but I hope the core insight resonates. Maybe genuine freedom isn't about being totally unconstrained, but about developing an honest awareness of the constraints themselves.
Mhm. And perhaps that honesty is the most potent form of freedom available to us. So, this raises an important question for you as you go back into your day-to-day life. If honesty about our constraints is the closest we get to freedom, think about just one choice you typically make, maybe something small, something routine. What might happen if tomorrow you consciously pause just before making it and try to notice? Try to see even one or two of those invisible hands, the habit, the cultural norm, the emotional trigger, the marketing nudge that might be guiding it. What changes just by noticing?